this slide, which is pretty topical given what's happened regarding certain individuals in the field and conflict of interest. Most of the work that I've done has largely been funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health, but I have had a little help from various drug companies. I have been a consultant for out of the labs in Little League with some research grants, been on speakers bureaus for a few companies, and other remuneration over time. But like I said, about 98% of the funding from my program has been from NIH. When you think about the core features of borderline personality disorder, you think about impulsive aggression, affective irritability, self-management. What I'm really going to focus on today is the impulsive aggressive angle. And the work that I've done over the years has really been in personality disorders in general. And when I first started doing that work, I was looking at serotonin function. And in the early days, we found these, I'll go through this later, these inverse relationships between serotonin function and impulsivity and aggression. And because of the way borderlines in my study happened to be, many of them were impulsive aggressive, and therefore they separated out as a group in terms of serotonin function. That may not, in fact, be the case. It really depends on what kind of borderlines you actually study. You know, let's talk about aggression, because impulsivity is important, but aggression is really the main behavior. And aggression is really, we thought of as a behavior of one individual directed at another person or object, which either verbal force or physical force is used to injure, coerce, to express anger. And we think of it as part of a complex trio of behavior, where aggression is the behavior, anger is the emotion, hostility is the cognition. So it's a little more complicated than we used to think it was. And when we talk about personality disorders in general, aggression is higher in personality disorders in general than healthy volunteers. That's not really surprising. This is the LHA, which is the life history of aggression measure, and this is a measure that actually reflects how many times you actually do things. How many times do you get into temper tantrums, how many times you break things, how many times do you hit people and the like. And this EDHI is more of a measure of aggressive temperament, or tendency to be aggressive. These are highly intercorrelated. If you're really talking about behavior, it's really the LHA. In any case, personality disorder patients are higher in aggression, no matter how you look at it, than normal controls for the interview. So any personality disorder has higher LHA scores. That's the main matter of clusters. So this kind of runs across PDs in general. We typically think of borderlines and maybe antisocials as being more aggressive. But that's not necessarily true. And this is a study looking at LHA aggression scores in normal controls, personality disorder patients who are not borderlines or antisocials. Borderline, oops, I don't know how many this borderline or antisocials who do not have prominent histories of aggression, and borderline antisocials that do have prominent histories of aggression. And prominent history of aggression in this case is defined as meeting criteria for intermittent explosive disorder. I'll say more about that later. And so what you see here with the LHA scores is normals have about a 5. The top of the scale is 25. So normal controls at 5, PDs and borderlines without IED are about 10, so about double. And you really get much higher scores if you hit the aggressive factor in there, which means that not all borderlines and or antisocials. In our studies, most of these people are borderlines, because sometimes they're also antisocial. Only about 1 out of 5 are actually just antisocial. So there's certainly borderlines that aren't terribly aggressive. That's an important thing to keep in mind. When we look at how many borderlines or antisocials have intermittent explosive disorder, this categorical problematic impulsive aggression, it depends on where you're looking for them. If you're recruiting them from a treatment-seeking sample, a whole lot of them have the problem. If you recruit them from a volunteer population, these weren't your regular ad to do just general research studies, it's about half of them will have this problem. And if you recruit them from the community, it's only about a quarter. This is actually based on 2 community studies. One was a very small study that I did, which showed 25% had personality disorders and borderline or antisocial. And data from the comorbidity study replication that Kessler did, this data I actually got just this week, which says the same thing, 25%. So this idea that borderlines are aggressive is certainly true, but they may or may not be aggressive depending on where you get them from, what setting you see them in, and those things. So aggression is not necessarily or very severe aggression, not necessarily part and parcel of being borderline, although they're certainly more aggressive than healthy volunteers. So let's get back to aggression. What kinds of aggression are there? There's several types that we think of. Social sanctions, which is where somebody does something because it's their job to do it. A police officer who has to do an aggressive act in the context of enforcing the law, that's a social sanction aggression. Certainly soldiers in war are social sanction. You can have a medically related reason. So if you have something that throws up your brain chemistry but can be fixed, it's something that is where you want to be aggressive when you're having this biomedical problem. The two types of aggression that are more important in general are premeditated aggression and impulsive aggression. There's some snickering here, assuming you're snickering at this. Of course, is Bobby Knight, who used to be my neighbor when I moved to Chicago. He was in Indiana, now he's in Texas, way better state for him. This is another one who's got both premeditated and impulsive aggression, which can happen in the same individual. The differences between the two are this. Premeditated aggression is goal-directed. These people commit aggressive acts simply to get something. And impulsive aggression is typically frustration, threat-induced aggression. It's very different in terms of the motivation. Primary aggression, which is what I study, really focuses on what we would call intermittent explosive disorder. And however you look at it, it's probably the best way we feel to look at problematic impulsive aggression. We sort of feel this is the categorical equivalent, categorical expression of a dimension of impulsive aggression. Now, IED has really been, or this concept has been in DSM since the beginning. In '56, it was called passive-aggressive personality aggressive type. And it was defined as persistent reaction to frustration, irritability. 12 years later, when DSM-2 came out, it was called explicit personality. It was gross outbursts of rage, strikingly different from easy behavior. And it said that the patient would be excitable, aggressive, with a response to pressures. And this is really pretty much what these kind of people are like. Until you got to DSM-3, we started to focus on loss of control and maybe having some irritable limbic focus. And this was the criteria set for DSM-3. So several discrete episodes of loss of control, of aggressive impulses, resulting in serious assault or destructive property, with behaviors out of proportion to particular distresses. It's not due to a whole bunch of other things, but the critical criteria, which really has hurt research in this area, was absence of signs of general impulsivity or aggressiveness in between episodes. So they were conceptualizing this disorder as people who were like, the guy plays the Incredible Hulk. So they have these huge aggressive outbursts, and in between could be very, very meek, timid individuals. And if you know people with problems with impulsive aggression, that's not what they're like. They actually have smaller rumblings in between these big attacks. By DSM-3 criteria, you couldn't give it a diagnosis. Therefore, everybody thought nobody had this disorder, but very few people had this disorder. DSM-4 criteria made it a little better. It got rid of that criteria, but it was still pretty vague. How many several episodes? What is a serious assault of act? Those are things that left. So we had to develop research criteria. And part of the thing about research criteria was, what kind of aggression are we talking about? Are we talking about any kind of aggression, goal-directed or frustration-induced? And we made the decision that our studies of aggression ought to really be impulsive aggression. Based on the fact that premeditated aggression is really more relevant to criminal justice systems and mental health systems, and explosivity really suggests impulsivity. More importantly, impulsive forms of aggression have psychobiological relevance. This is the first study that really suggested this. This was a study looking at serotonin metabolites in the CSF and looked at homicidal offenders, individuals who had killed someone or tried to kill someone. And what they found was that the folks who did this on purpose, who were deliberately trying to hurt somebody, had basically normal levels of serotonin metabolites in the CSF, whereas the impulsive folks had lower levels compared to the non-impulsives and compared to controls. So this is the first study that really suggested that the serotonin biology connection was impulsive aggression, not just general aggression. And this is a study of Mary Barrett that actually separated out impulsive aggressives from premeditated aggressives and gave them an agent that could be potentially anti-aggressive. And that anti-aggressive agent, phenytoin in this case, only worked to decrease aggression in the impulsive aggressive. And biological and treatment relationships suggesting that impulsive aggression is probably the angle that we really want to go. So we developed research criteria that allow for frequent but low intensity aggressive acts as well as infrequent but high intensity aggressive acts. We also, however, require the acts to be impulsive in nature and to mitigate the stress and impairment due to the aggressive acts. And that's not sitting with the DSM criteria. And so this is putting the criteria against each other. DSM-4 has 3 criteria sets, and we have a much more defined set of criteria for this disorder. And our hope is that when DSM-5 comes out, that IED will look more like this than like this. Part of the reason DSM-4 looks like this is there's very little data to help the DSM-4 committees really, make more of this criticism. Well, how much IED is out there? This is 2 community studies that were done. One study in 2004 was on a very small sample of community subjects, and it found that the DSM-4 IED lifetime was 4%. Our research criteria was at 5%, and in the last month it was between 1.6 and 2% across the country. In the Kessler study, which I was a second author, they reported 5.4% lifetime versus 3.5% in a year. Now, if you read that paper, they actually quoted a figure higher than about 7%. But 5.4% was the narrow definition of IED. The narrow definition of IED was 3 big attacks in any one year. The broad definition was 3 big attacks across your lifetime. Just a bit too broad. And in fact, the narrow criteria fits closer to the research criteria we use. I showed this before. I'll show it again. Let's look again at aggression as a function of PD-IED status. So I'm going to talk about 5. PDs and borderline antisocials together are about the same. IEDs are up to, and in NEA.BPD, ASPD, you really don't get much of an increase. These 2 groups are really statistically the same. These are statistically the same. Both sets of groups are better than have higher aggression scores than this. So what this really looks like, these IEDs, by the way, are all personality sort of anyway, is that if you add IED and BPD, you pretty much, if you look at this difference here and you add that difference to here, pretty much get this. But the point is that I want to make is that it can be borderline antisocial, which is borderline, and not and be aggressive compared to healthy volunteers, but not so aggressive compared to other personality patients. So we really need to think about aggressiveness when we think about borderlines as a separate kind of thing, as an additive kind of effect, so to speak. Well, let's talk about underpinnings of aggression, since we're talking about adding to the diagnosis. We can think about familiarity of IED. Just think of IED as this aggression factor. This is a study which we have to write this up, actually. I talked about this in some chapters, but we can actually write this up. This is a very well-controlled, blinded study, family history study of IED. We looked at 30 IEDs and about 20 controls, and we looked at the relatives and saw how many IEDs are in the relatives, and it was about 26% versus 8%. This was well controlled. The probands were only interviewed by separate raters, and the relatives were rated by. So it was very controlled. Everything was fine. The first thing we were wondering was if this familial risk had anything with comorbidity factors in the probands, and it didn't. So it didn't matter if the IED subject had a history of suicide attempt or not, major depression or not, alcohol or drug abuse or not, family risk was the same. So this is running across probands, regardless of what was going on in those folks in terms of comorbidity. It's also true for what was going on in the relatives. So if you look at a relative who had IED, the chance that they had MDD, major depression, was maybe 35%. The chances that the relative who didn't have IED, major depression, was maybe 29%. That was not a difference. And the same thing with alcohol, drug abuse, any anxiety disorder, and any disorder at all, really didn't get much of a blip with IED relatives versus non-IED relatives. So this is running in families, regardless of what the comorbidity was, in the proband, in the person with the disorder, or in the relatives. It's kind of a signal that runs in families. And that certainly suggests that there's genetics to this. So we also did twin studies. And this is a twin study looking at the Bus-Berkeley regression scales. I mentioned these before. This is the assessment of a tendency to be aggressive. And we looked at Bus-Berkeley regression scales at the time we did the study. some of the best correlations we have with certain nerve measures was with the muscular aggression skills. And there's 4 pieces to this: irritability, which is the tendency to explode; verbal assault is screaming and shouting; indirect is hitting people, throwing things around, banging; and direct assault is hitting people. And what you see is substantial genetic influence in every one of them, but the most important thing is as you go from the least severe form of aggression, which is verbal assault, from indirect to direct, you get an increase in genetic influence. So this is the lower limit of biology for this, because this only talks about what's in the DNA. Okay, so somebody, Paul mentioned before, these behaviors can lead people to get a head injury. Well, that's going to lead to increased aggressive behavior, and it's biological in nature, which is not in the DNA. And that's sitting in these environmental bars here. Impulsivity is also under genetic influence. None of this is really a surprise, although in the early 90s people didn't even want to think about this. This is barrier impulsivity, 41% is under genetic influence. Here we look at the mediation of impulsivity and aggression, and what you find is that the relationship between impulsivity and verbal assault, indirect assault, and direct aggression is also under genetic. So not just impulsivity and aggression, but the confluence of the two are under genetic influence as well. What are the environmental factors? Because these greenish bars here are pretty substantial too. They're greater than 50%. The big ones are experience of aggression as a child, which is the physical abuse that Paul Solich was talking about. Witnessing aggression as a child is sort of witnessing aggression. These two, of course, go together. If you're going to get aggressive as a child, you're probably going to be witnessing aggression too. And parental dysfunction is also kind of related to these things. People who use aggression in the home usually are not good parents. But these are really the two big things up here. And the effective environment is often thought to be mediated with deficits in social information processing. And the big one is aggression childhood being associated with these deficits. And the deficits are reduced encoding of relevant social information and increased tendency for hostile attributions. I'll say more about that. When they do these studies, what they do is they present the individual with a vignette, and it's a socially ambiguous vignette. So it would be something like, well, I'll give a vignette that we use in our studies for adults, because this is really developed for kids. So a socially ambiguous vignette for adults would be, you're in a karate class sort of exhibition, compared with somebody you know really well from your class. You start to do your thing, and the person hits you with a move you weren't taught, and you're hurt. And so we ask the person, how likely is it that that person that hit you that way to physically hurt you? How likely is it they did it to make you look bad? How likely is it they did it because they wanted to win a match? How likely is it they did it by accident? And so if they did it, if somebody says they did it because they wanted to physically hurt me and make me look bad, that's hostile. If they did it to win the match, it's instrumental. And if they did it by accident, it's benign. And so kids who've been abused, typically in those kind of vignettes, will say that that person did it because they didn't want to hurt me and make me look bad. The first thing is reduce the coding, and that has to do with asking people how much information, what did you remember from that vignette? And typically what happens is these people will remember less stuff, they'll pay attention to less stuff. And so they're really making their decisions based on less information as well. So this theory, which has been advocated really by Ken Dodge and Nikki Crick, is that the risk factor, which is aggression in childhood leading to aggressive behavior later in life, is mediated by these factors. And in point of fact, when they run the fancy statistical analyses, that's what they find. It's not a one-to-one thing, but it's highly statistically significant. Well, is this true in human beings, or is it not human beings? It's true in adults or IND subjects. One of the studies that we did was looking at Ekman faces, and part of the task was asking people to look at a neutral face and tell us what emotion was on the face. We didn't tell them they could say it's neutral. They had to say it's happy, disgust, surprise, fear, or anger. And what we decided was that if somebody called the neutral face angry, that's kind of this hostile attribution thing. And so we looked at the number of neutral faces called angry and correlated that with childhood trauma. This is a measure of how many various kinds of childhood trauma experience, including aggression. We found a positive correlation between the two. This is a very small n, and we can enlarge that soon enough. This is where we are with this analysis. And so it looks like what people like Ken Dodge and Nikki Crick have seen in children and adolescents may also be true in adults, and more specifically in people with genetic explosive disorder. All of them were personality disorder, and many of them were borderline personality disorder. Are the effects of environmental factors mediated by biogenic effects? Yes. This is a study by Cassidy, which came out in Science, which looked at monoamine A activity. Monoamine A is an enzyme that breaks down serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And when you do that, when you have less of that enzyme, those neurotransmitters are increased. That's good for serotonin, but it's bad for the other neurotransmitters. It's not good for norepinephrine and dopamine to increase in somebody. And they looked at the relationship between these kinds of genotypes and a history of maltreatment. And what they found was that as you go from no history, probable history, to severe history, you get this stepwise increase in disposition toward violence or in being convicted for violence. And it's pretty strong if you've got low MEO activity. It's very much dampened by high MEO activity. It's clear gene-environment interaction, very exciting film. Neurobiologically, aggression is most likely associated with dysfunction of serotonin, but it's also associated with dysfunction of other central systems. And I'm going to see if I can go through the slides quickly. Impulsive aggression is a nice example of translational research, because what happened was in the 70s, animal studies revealed inverse relationships between brain serotonin levels and aggressive response. So animals that had low serotonin would be more aggressive when you provoke them. Low serotonin equals high aggression. And then in the late 70s, a study was done in human beings showing an inverse correlation between the serotonin metabolite, 5-HIF, and a lifetime history of aggression. This score is essentially the LHA that I was talking about before, and it represents only aggressive things that keep action, a tendency to be aggressive. And this correlation is very, very strong. And what's also on the slide that may be harder to see is these white dots here are individuals with suicidal histories. These orange squares are people without suicidal histories. And what you see is these white circles are really out here in the low serotonin part of the graph, and really in the higher aggression part of the graph. And this led to the thinking that low serotonin is related to the history of suicidal behavior, as well as an increased risk of being directly aggressive. And so it's not really surprising that maybe when borderlines make suicide attempts, that they're also angry and aggressive at the same time. So all goes together. I mentioned this before. This is a study that showed that it was impulsive aggression as opposed to non-impulsive aggression that was really key for serotonin. This is a study that actually Paul Sola was referring to. This is the study that sort of started the work he was doing by Stanley and Mayer. And they were looking at the frontal cortex serotonin transporters and serotonin 2 receptors in violent suicide victims versus violent accident victims. And what they found was the serotonin transporter was low in violent suicide victims compared to accident victims, and serotonin 2 receptor was high. And that really led to this idea that presynaptic serotonin is down, postsynaptic serotonin receptors go up in compensation. So that's where that story started. I entered the field at around that time, and we were looking at physiological aspects of serotonin function. And we used a drug called fenfluramine, which is an amphetamine analog that dumps out the serotonin that's there and blocks the uptake. This gives you a big serotonin pulse, and what you basically get is a nice big rise in prolactin over time. It's that difference peaks the baseline that gives you your measure of how much you've activated the serotonin system. And from the very beginning of this work, we get these very nice inverse correlations between various measures of aggression and impulsivity with this measure of serotonin. This correlation is very, very high, negative 0.77. At the time, it was the same as the correlation that Brown had shown with 5-HIF. We did more studies later down the road, larger samples, correlation is less robust, but still highly significant. And this is probably what the real relationship is. We also get these relationships with platelet serotonin transporters, and there's also evidence in other studies that people in the lab receivers lab showing the same kind of thing when you look at brain levels binding to the serotonin transporter. So basically, low serotonin equals high aggression. I'm going to skip that one. But there are other neurotransmitter dysfunctions with depression that may be true in borderline as well. Problems with catecholamines, vasopressin, and oxytocin. This is a norepinephrine slide. This is looking at the receptor responsivity of the alpha-2 norepinephrine receptor and its relationship to irritability, tendency to explode. That's a positive approach. So the more sensitive those receptors are, the more likely you are to explode when you provoke. Vasopressin is something that's interesting in terms of aggression, because animal studies have shown that if you increase vasopressin, animals are more aggressive. If you give vasopressin receptor antagonists, they'll become less aggressive. And this is a study where we looked at CSF levels of vasopressin and found positive correlations with aggressiveness in personality disorder patients. This is new data which is in preparation. Oxytocin, which is sort of the opposite peptide to vasopressin, shows the opposite effects. You can see inverse relationship of oxytocin and like-issues of aggression in personality disorder patients. And so we're starting to see it as a more complex picture. And what's also true is these things are all interrelated with each other in various ways, depending on how you look at it. Other things are also possibly involved in depression, including testosterone, ACTH, cholesterol, and fatty acids. I don't have time to get into the details of this. The stories are not entirely consistent. And testosterone, certainly physiological levels, may be more relevant to things like competition. Sorry about this. Yes? Yes? All right. Which light is on time? What are you getting in? All right, I'll see you later. Today. Where's my daughter? She's flying home for the extended weekend from Vanderbilt. Let me turn my phone off now, because I wasn't actually expecting it. Well, where in the brain are these abnormalities? The case of NEA.BPD suggests that a big part of this, of course, is the ventral medial and neural prefrontal cortex, which is something that's been thought for quite a while. This is the first initial data that really sort of suggested that was an important thing. These are the brain areas that are relevant to emotional regulation, trauma, impulsive aggression. Oral prefrontal cortex is medial, red is ventral medial, blue is dorsolateral, prefrontal, amygdala, and anterior cingulate. And there are various circuits here. The big circuits really are key between these three slides there. So I want to get to the emotional regulation part of this. Mary Bess was one of my graduate students, and she did a study looking at emotional information processing in terms of identifying emotional faces. And the first thing we found is when we look at these personality disorder IPD subjects, they made more errors in identifying anger, disgust, and surprise than healthy volunteers did. So there's a problem in their cognitive appraisal ability to make a decision about what these people's faces really reflect. So and so that work really suggested there was something wrong with this emotional processing. And so we went ahead to do some functional imaging studies. But before I get to our functional imaging studies, I'm going to go through some other studies that we've done. And these are PET studies. And this is, one of the first people to really look at aggression in PET study was Adrian Rainey. This is a paper that came out almost 10 years ago. And he looked at prefrontal cortex and some cortical areas. And he looked at lateral, medial, left, and right. And he looked at controls versus premeditated murderers, which are these predatory murderers, and affective murderers, which are the impulsive, aggressive murderers. And what you really see is a sort of gradient, which is sort of reverse depending on where you look at it. So in the prefrontal cortex, the affective murderers have less activity in the medial and lateral prefrontal cortex, which is the area that should be inhibiting you from doing things. And in the subcortex, which are the areas of the brain that sort of move you to do things, when stimulated, it goes in the other direction, so that they have greater activity. So you see this imbalance in subcortical and cortical structures, and it's in the wrong direction. Because this suggests less inhibition, and this suggests more drive. And you don't want to go there, you don't have to reverse. This was a study done at NIH in normal subjects, which is very interesting. And what they did was they asked people to think through certain scenarios. So one scenario was you go in the elevator with your mother, and these two strangers get on the elevator, You go up to the 10th floor and nothing happens and you get off the elevator. Next scenario is you get in there and these two guys start beating up on your mother and you don't do anything. So you're a bad son. But next one was these people start beating up on your mother and somebody holds you back from hitting them. And the last scenario is they start beating up on you and you beat the crap out of them. And that's the unrestrained aggression. And when they compare unrestrained aggression versus, you know, the elevator goes up and it's uneventful, they saw lots of deactivation in broadening area 11, which is about the frontal gyrus, suggesting that even just thinking about these things, just imagining, deactivates this part of the brain, which supposedly release subcortical structures to do their thing. This is a study by Larry Sieber, who is my mentor. And actually, Bob, were you there when this was being done? Yeah. And so this study was looking at FDG PET patients with BPD, but also IED, but at both disorders. 6 of those versus 6 normal controls, and they gave fenfluramine challenge versus placebo. And this was the area with all the fancy analyses where we had decreased serotonergic activation in the IED BPDs compared to healthy volunteers. And certainly in the right place. This is a study by Paul Soloff, and he could explain this better. I was actually hoping to present this slide so I could just skip over it. But this was done about really around the same time in BPDs and control subjects, and he found similar sort of things, although in more findings than Larry found. He found decreased uptake in BPDs versus controls in the orbital frontal, left temporal, left parietal, left caudal. So there's more diffuse differences in activation in these borderlines. I suspect, actually I should ask you this, were all those borderlines also fairly aggressive, or was a pretty good range in terms of aggression? Pretty good range. That's what I would expect, because if these folks look like the BPDs, they probably look more similar to what Larry showed. But this is what BPDs look like. You know, if you're average BPD, it's probably what you find. This is a study by Antonio New using MCPP challenge instead of fenfluramine. This is a serotonin agonist. It's kind of a less specific agonist than we'd like, but hard to find it really into the cingulate. And what she found was that the compulsive aggressive folks, again, these are borderline personality sort of IEDs, had diminished activity in the anterior part of the anterior cingulate, well, the anterior part of the cingulate versus the healthy volunteers. So you see some kind of blockage here. And that's very exciting as well, because not only are we looking at orbital areas, you're also finding something going on in the cingulate. Now, functional imaging, I'm going to present some work that we've done. This stuff is in print. It's not, sorry, it's in press, the biologics. I'll speak later to these slides. We look at cortical impulse responses to harsh faces in IED subjects. And in this group, most of them are not cortical impulses. I'm sort of concerned about really looking at IEDs. This was what they call a block design, where you show a whole bunch of angry faces in a block and a bunch of neutral faces in a block, you know, that sort of thing. And you look at the MRI signal. So this is when you should present your stimuli, and typically what happens is you get a change in the magnetic signal that you can actually measure. It's not a very big change, but it's certainly very detectable. And what we found was that when we looked at the amygdala, we found activation of harsh faces versus rest greater in IEDs than in healthy volunteers. We also found it for angry faces. And in point of fact, it was the angry faces that we really got the finding. It was really an anger, rather than disgust and fear, we could take a look at what the activity was. So maybe specific IEDs for looking at angry faces. This is the parameter extracts of the emotion, and here you see the same thing in bar graph. High activation for angry faces versus controls, and kind of up and down for the rest of the emotion faces. What's interesting is that the Donegan study that looked at similar kinds of faces, although it didn't look at anger, it was looking at borderlines versus normal controls, found increased activation in the amygdala on both sides, no matter what the emotion was. So maybe that this very, you know, this diffuse activation, or activation across emotional faces and borderlines, they can't process, it just activates everything. Whereas in IEDs, they really are acting specifically to anger faces, basically which are triggered anger, aggressive response. We also found a correlation between LJ aggression and the right amygdala response to anger faces. The problem is, of course, we don't have a lot of people in the middle, so you know, we hope to have more subjects, but it's a strong correlation. And there also was less activation in the orbital frontal cortex, and that's shown better on the next slide. When we looked at OMPPC, OMPFC, and IED versus controls, this is bone response to anger faces. I should say that this was also an implicit emotion ask. We didn't ask people to tell us what the emotion was. We just said, is it a man or a woman? But brain is processing the emotions nevertheless. And so what we found was we looked at the IEDs, they're just not activating OFC compared to the healthy volunteers. So they're not showing the kind of activation that they should be showing to IED faces. So again, you've got this imbalance between cortical structures and so forth. The structural imaging, the work in this again started with Adrian Gray. He looked at antisocial personality perturbations. I'm not sure how many of these folks are really psychopathic as well, but he found a decrease in prefrontal brain activity. We've done some DDN studies as well. Although very much sort of describing how these things are done, and I'll just skip over the slides. And I hope all you find this interesting. We found decreased brain kind of the same place you did, except we didn't find it in other areas. But that could be because these are just IEDs and not an IED borderlines with more diffuse things going on. So look at 40 healthy controls and 40 IEDs. They're all in there. And so this area of the brain doesn't have as much brain matter as the other areas. Let me skip that one. We've also done DTI studies. These things are not that hard. You put people in the scanner, you might as well get everything. It's kind of what we do. And they sort of charge us the same. What diffuse attention imaging does is it images sort of white matter tracks or white matter area, and there's a lot of areas where there are decreased or abnormalities in white matter tracks. And I'll just sort of read this off here. And specifically, it's cortex striatum terminalis. Of course, and these are areas where white matter tracks are connected into the temporal lobe and the frontal cortex. And important again in this cortical circuit that's so important in these problems. So, just to sort of sum up, aggression is something that is quite prevalent, if you think about it in terms of an explosive disorder. It has strong biological correlates. It's certainly something that's critical to borderline personality disorder. And we can find areas of the brain that seem to belong to circuitry that probably lead people to being more aggressive and more impulsive than other folks. These are a list of my collaborators in Chicago. Notoriously, Lauren Fund does a lot of the imaging work. Constantine Afranakis is the one that does the CI work. Mike McCluskey and Kristen Jacobson. Mike McCluskey does a lot of work with laboratory assessments of aggression as well as psychosocial treatments of aggression, which I didn't protect. So Kristen is our twin person. Philadelphia's Rich Calusi and Scott Price. In New York, Larry Seaver and Tony New, and a whole variety of outside collaborators, including Nikki Crick, which is how I got into the social information processing. And thank you very much. I finished on time.